Horrorphiles, you're listening to Dissecting Horror, examining the anatomy of fear in film, television, and literature. I'm writer and performer Kelsey Zukowski.
I'm filmmaker Stephen Aguilera. We gather here today to remember Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, streaming now on Netflix with 8 episodes. This service will be spoiler-free.
We are the Horror Whisperers, your champions of horror and keepers of the fearscape on this podcast of frightsome delights, if you will.
I will, and we hope you will join us too, won't you? Bizarre nightmares unfold in 8 tales of terror in a visually stunning, spine-tingling horror collection curated by Guillermo del Toro, according to the Internet Movie Database. If you've ever watched Rod Serling's Night Gallery made in the early 70s, you'll recognize the similar presentation, which I presume to be an homage. Here, Guillermo steps out from the dark and showcases a large piece of cabinetry with various drawers, panels, and compartments revealing objects, which are the focus of each episode. Between the room echo and his thick Spanish accent, and I love the character of his voice, but I really strained to make out what he was saying, and my crappy television speakers may have something to do with that, but especially whenever he said each episode's director's name at the end, I had no idea what words were coming out of his mouth.
Subtitles.
Yeah, I suppose that would be the solution, wouldn't it?
I didn't have too many difficulties. There was maybe 1 or 2 things that I'm like, oh, that's interesting, and maybe like a word or 2 was missed. But overall, I personally loved hearing Del Toro's introduction to each episode.
Wow, the power just went out a little bit. I should mention that we have some sort of I don't know if it's an all-out rainstorm, but it's a rare day in LA when it rains at all, and it is doing so right now, of course, in the middle of our recording. The power just kind of flickered on and off, but that's what backup batteries are for. So let's forge on, shall we?
Yes, full spooky, gloomy vibes here, and hopefully it's just add to the atmosphere, right?
There we go.
I personally loved hearing Del Toro's introduction of each segment. His passion and personal insight for both the genre and the intrigue and enlightenment it can trigger really shines and resonates. And it definitely nods to horror anthologies past, like Tales from the Crypt, while still maintaining its own identity and a very Del Toro signature to it. There was, even in one of the episodes, a fun little Creepshow reference. And I love the cabinet itself as well as the whole opening. I binged majority of the episodes, and this is one series that I never wanted to hit that skip intro button. I felt utter marvel and morbid fascination with the dark academia meets ancient monsters reawakening aesthetic. It's surely steeped into creativity and dark examination. Del Toro's introduction, I thought, worked to get the wheels churning in your mind, igniting those wicked wonders and letting them seep in very true roots of what a Cabinet of Curiosities was meant to do.
I first went into this thinking, okay, these are going to be 35-minute, 45-minute things. There are only 8 episodes, but all told, it was 7.4 hours to get through everything. I did the math.
Yeah. It felt like a good amount of, terrifying tales, but I wouldn't, if there, I wasn't like, oh, I'm glad this is over, or that's enough of that. I would have welcomed a couple more episodes too. And yeah, if someone's like less of a binger, I think it still works because you really don't have to watch them back to back. I like that there was, cohesive themes and definitely some commonalities that came up in episode to episode. And there is, definitely a connection, and I'm glad because that horror anthologies that have zero connection at all, at least whether it be style, themes, but without that, it kind of feels a little like you just threw a bunch of random shorts together. They definitely work as standalone episode. You could just watch one. It's not really one where you're like, wait, what happened on the last episode? So
none of the episodes take place in present day. They're all in different eras. In my mind, as a filmmaker, well, that's going to add a lot to the budget because period pieces are always a lot more expensive and logistically trying to produce.
Well, in the opening of the first episode, Guillermo del Toro, when he introduces the cabinet stories as a dark vault holding mysteries and wonders of the past, he is commenting on the cabinet itself and how it is this relic of the past. So for me, it kind of makes sense that all of the stories would essentially be period pieces and look at this dark history. As he says, that odd place where one keeps the past alive, the things that remind us, our deeds, our darkness, our sins. Also, Cabinet of Curiosities were largely a thing of the past. There's still niche ones here or there at oddity museums, but for the most part, They really were something that was most prominent between 1600s to 1800s. So it kind of works as a great time capsule, yet it still digs into very human, universal flaws and legitimate vulnerabilities, including greed, loss, fear, desperation, even disassociation and numbness. Sometimes pain or even weakness triggers a deeper darkness beyond our understanding.
I think they started off with a very strong episode. Even the first two were perhaps up there with my favorites, and those were also the shortest two.
Yeah, overall, I found it to be a very fascinating, well-crafted horror anthology. Really, I feel like one of the best horror anthologies I've seen in years. It was very full of rich exploration on both the human condition and the endless dark mysteries of the universe. It works as a collection of dark Gothic fables, I felt, in many instances serving as forewarnings of the faults, trappings, desperation, and downfall of man. And in other instances, simply digging its teeth into the awe-inspiring terror and beauty of the macabre. From the manifestations of evil in the world and the beyond to much more personal trauma, the series beautifully showcases enthralling grisly horror and the many shapes it can take. There were some commonalities between episodes, such as a focus on Lovecraftian horror, monsters, a lot of body horror, especially the first couple episodes, and a few towards the end, we saw lessons of greed and desperation. But many of those things I find quite enthralling and are more rare than they should be in the genre, so I really did relish them. Plus, there were some commonalities that helped make it a more cohesive, connected piece. Overall, there was incredible range from one story to the other, tackling body horror, ghosts, grief, alternate dimensions, cosmic horror, wonderfully gruesome monsters, and even the horrors of consumerism and unrealistic beauty standards. Not to mention the most atrocious and nightmarish monstrosities of all, rats. A gut-wrenching, utterly repulsive, entrapping, and horrifying number of rats in several manifestations that will now haunt me.
I was struck early on by the production value, and not just the quality of cinematography, which was amazing, but the acting was just astonishing. The casting alone stood out. Even if the story suffered, I was so entertained just looking at the people they cast. The opening titles, there was only, I think, 2 shots that looked a little CG, and maybe every once in a while a little CG-ness peeks out on the effects, but I really enjoy and revel in the level of care of filmmaking and how they just don't hold back. And even just the gore levels, my God, the body horror and the swearing and everybody smoking in every other episode.
Yeah.
It's just lighting up this and that and drug use. And they just didn't give 2 fucks about restraining anything that might be considered un-PC. And I think maybe the fact that none of them take place in present day, it fits better to see people who used to smoke a lot everywhere. And I really liked that. And I'm surprised that such things are there for anybody to see on streaming. I don't know, where's the line going to be drawn someday? We'll wait and find out. But man, you think people are getting more conscious of cancel culture, but it seems to be more in the way of comedy than horror. Horror is getting much more graphic, and I love it.
Yeah, even though Guillermo del Toro had, he probably had a certain amount of creative control, but really each one of these, so 2 of the stories were based on stories of his, but he didn't direct any of them. He was initially supposed to, but COVID and other delays in scheduling had it so he was not able to. So yeah, we don't know for sure how much, creative control he really had, but a lot of it really, I think, goes with his style and connection to horror and the gothic and monsters.
I've listened to some of his commentary tracks for Pan's Labyrinth is one, and I didn't have any issues understanding his accent, but he is so articulate. He really speaks not just the English language well, but the language of horror very well, and he knows his film history. I said on our last episode that M. Night Shyamalan was a big influence with his Sixth Sense film.
Yeah.
But Guillermo, I think he most closely aligns with my taste in horror and the look and feel and the fantasy and just the freshness of it all. When you see something coming out from him, you think, oh, this is going to be fresh. and it's also going to be very disturbing on some level. And he will murder children in his thing.
Yeah.
He has no restraint, whatever tells the story. And even if it's just producing it, he's not even directing it, it carries weight. And I go, okay, I want to see this.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The gore and monsters and everything that you mentioned were pretty exquisite. Like, it was great just to see such a gruesome yet primal, wretched quality on screen. Yeah, overall, there were definitely some CG moments, but they were pretty minimal, and I felt overall it just felt like a very intricate, real, monstrous kind of awakening. So yeah, definitely lots of blood, lethal hits, bleeding out arteries, melting flesh, body deterioration. Overall, just really great effects, and it definitely goes there in the grisly horror, while still some episodes have this elegant beauty and tragedy to them. So it was a really good mix of kind of some of Del Toro's style is more gothic really than horror, but this kind of infuses those two worlds really well.
There's a beauty to his work. He finds ways of introducing either music or storylines which you feel a certain aesthetic to it, and the artistry. There's an artist behind it.
Yeah, I was really impressed by the cast and even the directors of these pieces. It was interesting. There was a lot of notable cast members that at least I recognized from a lot of comedy and fantasy epics. We have actors that I knew from Scrubs, Mythic Quest, Freaks and Geeks, and then, of course, the Harry Potter and a Narnia connection. It was a great role for Crispin Glover. I really loved him. He had this mysterious, ominous, unnerving sort of allure with a connection to the darkness. In the first episode, Sebastian Roche from Originals and Supernatural, he's been in, half these actors I'm mentioning have been, if you look at their credits, they've been in over 100 things, like very, prolific genre, but a lot of them were from kind of outside of horror or maybe not as known for horror. But yeah, every one of them, the presence that they brought and how they kind of dug into this dark, intricate world was mesmerizing. Each story is told by a different director, and many who have made their mark in the world of horror and gothic cinema. You have Jennifer Kent, The Babadook, Keith Thomas, who did the recent Firestarter, Anna Lily Amapour, who did A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and Panos Cosmatos, who did Mandy. Even Catherine Hardwicke, who hasn't done as much horror, but she has definitely touched upon otherworldly beauty, tragedy, ferocity. She probably most well known for 13. Recently did a Lost Boys, Twilight, of course, and even Little Red Riding Hood of hers had a very gothic twist. But it was kind of interesting to see the creative forces in front of him behind the camera here.
The guy in the first episode we'll get to in a second, I remember him from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And he's always the guy
it's been a while since I've seen that.
It's one of my favorite films. I don't know why.
I love it too. It's probably my favorite Coen Brothers film.
I've got a handful of films that I put in my top 10 that have nothing to do with horror, and they're so random, like Bend It Like Beckham.
Wow, okay.
And Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Gosford Park, and Sideways.
Okay, nice. It's a good range though, versatility.
It's inexplicable though, but they're the sort of movies that I would watch over and over and over again. I just love being amongst those characters, so to speak. Whereas some of my technically favorite films, like Star Wars, I never watch.
Oh wow!
Empire Strikes Back, all those. For some reason, I need a special occasion for those. Some of my horror films, even I'll wait until Halloween to watch.
Episode 1, Lot 36.
An ex-vet buys storage locker contents to pay off debts, but buys more than he bargained for. Wow, that's cheesy. When he purchases a lot owned by a strange old man. I didn't write this. This all came from IMDb. So this episode was captivating to me because I have a fascination with old junk, the stuff that you'd see like in flea markets or in yard sales and so forth. And I think about, this was probably loved by someone at one point. You can see, especially when they're well worn, that there's some
Yeah.
history there, and you wonder what happened to the person this used to belong to. And I just find it fascinating. In a way, you can back up and say that beyond this episode, the entire series is more or less about objects that were perhaps abandoned or left behind or found by other people, and the stories that go with that. So I think this is a very appropriate first episode to go with. In this particular episode, a person's valuables left in the storage locker would be all that remains of their existence. Perhaps they died, and so they just have to get rid of all the contents eventually. But the ultimate expression of that would be a person's gravestone. If you go to a cemetery and look at some of these from, let's say, 100 years ago, you wonder, is this literally the only thing that exists? Could it be that all of their possessions have just eventually been thrown away by their offspring over generations? But this deteriorated piece of marble from 150 years ago may literally be the only thing that exists that marks this person's life. And I don't know why I find that cool. If I'm driving down the 5 going to San Francisco, you see screech marks on the streets, and you think, what? There's a story there. Something happened that caused that. So any kind of echo of the past that survives, especially if it could be a bit chilling or tell of a tragedy, makes me wonder as a storyteller what story took place there, and does anybody remember it anymore?
Yeah, and I think that's a big point of this series of like exploring these echoes of the past and what was left behind and being preserved sort of like a time capsule.
It's fascinating to me how we as individuals, as families, and as societies can just forget things which were very monumental in one period. Maybe a plague happened, and now there's a great plague where tens of thousands or millions of people died.
Right.
That's interesting. And how a big movie star from the 40s, like, who? I don't know who that is, but they were just, the Tom Cruise of their era. And now it could be that in a few decades, people will ask, Owen Wilson? Who's?
Right. That episode wasn't one that was like one of the bigger standouts to me, but it was intriguing. It was interesting. Definitely the main characters a bit less sympathetic than in some of the other episodes. So I wouldn't say I really felt for him, but also it seemed like a big part of the point is showcasing those faults and that greed, and even just some things that aren't the smartest that he does. It is obviously not going to be respecting any darker spirits that he might be tangling with. It worked more as, I guess, a morality tale or a forewarning. So it definitely worked. I liked kind of some of the dark artifacts, and as they started to explore and figure out some of that more. Yeah, it was intriguing. I enjoyed it. It wasn't one that I'm like, oh, whoa, this one really connected with me, but not a bad opening to the series.
I wanted to explore that locker he was in. It looked like there were so many cool antiques.
Oh, right.
My mom typically watches a lot of those antique things on Discovery or whatever Travel Channel, hearing the stories. And it's actually pretty creepy when they're driving by and they find this barn and they all go in and there's like these old carnival shit and rusting, decaying clown art and just the whole death of the past. And you can see like this was probably something that a lot of kids played on and it was really fun, but now collectors might be getting into it. The lead actor in this I found entertaining, but he was a dumbass. And you saw that this is going to be some sort of morality tale and he's going to get his comeuppance at the end. I wish, I'm not going to say anything about the ending, but I thought there was going to be a bit more poignance to it. He does a stupid thing which leads to him, and that made me a little disappointed and annoyed with him, and I wasn't really rooting for him. Not that I was really rooting for him throughout, but he was oddly likable and amusing to watch.
Episode 2, Graveyard Rats. A grave robber
eyes the riches of a wealthy new arrival to the cemetery, but must survive a maze of tunnels and an army of rodents to secure them. Let's kick this one off with a coincidental question I asked of Kelsey on our last podcast. which we actually cut, but we were going to add it to our Patreon page. But I think it's befitting that we restore it here. Take a listen, won't you? Do you have any kind of sharp fear of something in real life?
Rats.
Rats.
I'm horrified of rats. That's deep paranoia for sure. I've always found them disgusting and just like makes my skin crawl. I think it's part of like definitely one of my worst nightmares is just the thought of being like paralyzed, not able to move, and rats just hoarding and infesting me and like eating me alive. That would be the absolute worst nightmare of mine. But I used to live in Chicago, and there's a lot more rats around there. I had an instance where one came like darting at me as I was about to come home one day. I was in such a panic, I dislocated my kneecap.
Ooh.
So that was fun.
What about mice? Do those have the same thing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, rats are a little bit more disgusting, but yeah, same sort of thing. I'm not really a big rodent fan. I mean, I guess rabbits are okay. That's about the only
Squirrels,
thing.
those are tree rats.
Squirrels are okay. But yeah, any rodents, I wouldn't like the idea of them like jumping or crawling on me. But yeah, it's mostly rats and mice that are the one that really, that really terrify me. Even worse, after I had dislocated my kneecap, it was winter in Chicago. I'm on crutches, and you can see in the snow circling in my apartment are rat tracks. And then I'm like, these guys are just getting into my mind and tormenting me at this point. But so not a big fan. If there's like I don't enjoy it, but if there's like rat scenes in a horror movie, like I'll watch it. I'll suffer through it. But something like Willard or even there was the Nosferatu adaptation that they did. There's a lot of like long scenes with just streets and crowds and like expanding rats everywhere. So yeah, that definitely like makes my skin crawl. And if in real life someone's like, "Oh, there's a rat coming here," I would be running. I'd be out of here.
And for the record, rabbits are not classified as rodents, but are logomorpha.
Team Logomorpha, then. No wonder I don't mind them.
Fun fact there. What are the odds that immediately following that recording, a perfect depiction of your worst nightmare would be released to you on Netflix?
I can be affected by horror, but I hardly ever have like physical reactions. I'm not really someone who flinches, let alone jumps in horror films. And I have to say, this episode elicited the most dramatic visceral reaction I've had to anything I can remember watching in years. And then, yes, especially since we had just discussed essentially my deepest fear in consuming paranoia and what specifically that worst nightmare would look like. And then this episode essentially brought that alive and then went even further. So needless to say, definitely gave me quite the reaction. And great material to discuss, of course, too. Because I love how horror can do so many things, and I applaud it for that. But unquestionably, one of the most powerful things that it can do is that it doesn't stray away from the grotesque or the uncomfortable or things that really make your skin crawl. And especially for once you watch so many horror films, you do have a way of becoming sort of desensitized that you still feel or are in that horror, but when there's those certain things that really cause you a bigger reaction and really kind of cause you terror, it's good to kind of dive into that, and really anything that can affect you on screen like that, there's definitely power there.
I imagine you very much scrunched up in a little ball watching that episode, keeping the lights on. But
lights were off, but it was a lot of me shouting at the screen, a lot of like clenching of my hand became more like a talon. Yeah, just a lot of shouting, especially when character starts to fight against the rats a little bit. I'm like, kill those rats, get them.
It was pretty real. There was, I think, one of the rats that had a scar. They tried to make one look distinctive. I think it was the same one that we see as the first rat that bites him looked a little bit CG, but overall, I think they
Yeah.
looked very realistic, and not just their fur and whatnot, but their motions, the way they would crawl around all on top of each other and just swarm. Oh man.
Yeah, like really the reaction it gives me, like I even rewatched some of the worst of the clips right before so it could be fresh in my mind because I, like to terrorize myself like that. It makes me want to like gag or vomit. Like I just find them utterly repulsive. And I think it's like, yes, one rat is bad, but it's really those like hordes of rats, like just continuing like this ocean and sea. And part of it is also like even just my fear and, horrendous nightmares I've had in my life, is sort of that a little bit ties into body horror and that like fear of not having control. So yes, it is that I find rats disgusting. But it's that like thought of them just hordes of them just kind of taking over your body where you're helpless and they're just like infesting you. And this series really rode with that fear and explored it in many variations, and a lot of ways went even further than that. It really really gave me some new material for the Nightmare Bank.
Well, fortunately, it was only 37 minutes. It was the shortest episode.
This one, but I'll say that it wasn't the only rats in this series as a whole.
There is a black and white version of this episode. If you go into the bonus episodes, this is literally the only of the 8 that they duplicated, but black and white. Nothing else different about it. The cut is exactly the same. They call it the Silver Screen Horror Edition.
I'm guessing it's probably like a little bit of like a throwback or homage to the time it took place in.
I do have a small not rabbit, but probably have a few rabbit stories too, but I have a rat story where I was once at a friend's house. He was not present, but there was a very strong smell of death, and it was getting worse with each day. I used to use his computer in this sort of back room of their house up in the Bay Area, and I just had enough. And I found this little saw that was pointy. I think it was made for sheetrock. And I just started cutting into his wall. I probably should have asked first, but I was following my nose to where the smell was coming from. And at the base of this wall, I had cut open a square. And at the end of the last cut, the little square collapsed outward with a dead rat, as big as you can imagine a rat being.
Ugh.
You've seen very large squirrels.
Yeah.
Imagine the biggest squirrel you've ever seen, but it's a rat instead. And I think the decomposition makes the body a little bit bigger, but the smell almost knocked me over. And I jumped back and gasped. I didn't scream or anything, but it was one of the most horrifying real life things that I've ever encountered. And I scooped it up somehow and threw it in the trash can. And I was just showing it to everybody when they got home.
God.
And they were just taken aback by how gigantic this dead rat was. And it was in their house.
Oh my God. Rancid vermin. I mean, a dead rat's better than a living rat. But yeah, if that happened in my house or somewhere I was staying, it would be good. It was dead and gone, but just the thought of a giant rat crawling through my walls would probably haunt me so much I'd just have to immediately leave and never come back.
Well, the poison they laid out for it did its thing, and that's how it died in the wall.
Well, that's good. Yay, poison.
I did notice in these first 2 episodes, we have the exact same specific trope employed, where the main character has a huge debt that they must pay off. And that's what's propelling them through the story, despite whatever horrors or obstacles might be in their way. And I thought that was odd that they would do 2 stories back to back with even an instance where they are each threatened, you better pay up by tomorrow, blah, 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 or you're going to be beat up or dead. And it was so exactly the same circumstance that they should have spaced those episodes apart or rewrote one of them so it wasn't the same frickin' goal of both characters in separate episodes.
Yeah, I agree. Probably would have helped to space it out. When I was initially watching it, I was thinking, oh, well, this is maybe just like a series about the greed and desperation and downfall of man, which it does go into that a lot, but these first two are really the only ones that really focus on, like a debt and that it being a financial, desperation more. So, they could come off as a little repetitive, and I could see if you were someone like just checking this out, you're like, oh, okay, they're all going to be the same thing. But it actually gets way more expansive from there, and even the ones that do still kind of dig into desperation, it's more like things like loss and dealing with mortality and things like that. Yeah, it was a bit of an odd choice to have them both back to back in the beginning.
It deals with grave robbers, as you see immediately. And that in itself, it seems like a strange choice to bury people with jewelry and valuables, knowing that it's just creating a target for your loved one's remains. But there's a bit of a treasure hunt if you're into that sort of thing, intermingled with this as well.
Right. Episode 3, The Autopsy.
A seasoned sheriff investigates a dead body in the woods and calls on an old pal, a medical examiner, to help piece together a series of chilling events. I have little to say about this one, except that I really liked it. I liked it a lot, actually, except I wish they'd shaved maybe 5 or 10 minutes. The pacing was just a little bit too slow. But F. Murray Abraham is
from Mythic Quest.
Is that?
That's how I know he's one of the actors who's done like over 100 things, but I absolutely love, he plays like a sci-fi writer on Mythic Quest, which is like it's like a workplace comedy, but it like takes place in like a sort of a epic fantasy video game company. And he is just amazing in it. So yeah, really, this episode could have had very little going on, and like I just kind of find him enigmatic and fascinating to watch. So, and it was I'd have to look at his full credits. I might have like saw him in something else horror before I knew the name, but it was, for me, it was most recently I've seen him and loved him as this sort of comedy character, and then seen him in this was like very dark, serious murder mystery with like all the darker, more morbid things happening. Was really interesting just to see him in that environment.
Going back to my favorite movies of all time, he was in what was at one time my favorite movie of all time, Amadeus. He plays Salieri, which is, I would say, one of the greatest villains ever portrayed on film.
All right.
I think he won an Oscar for
Bringing it back then.
Go see Amadeus. And if you can avoid the director's cut and just see the theatrical version, which is shorter and tighter, which I wish this episode was, I think you'll absolutely love it. It's just the most brilliant movie. Same director who did Cuckoo's Nest.
Okay, nice. I think it was just the atmosphere and visuals that it had, like just so steeped in the morbid and the dead and what was happening. And again, I absolutely loved the monster, and kind of where it goes in the end was very dark, but had a certain very morbid beauty to it, I guess.
You have a character in Abraham who seems unassuming enough, but you get a weight, a gravitas about his presence and his ability to match wits with this supernatural terror that's been around for eons. It feels like, I don't know, you're sending in, I can't think of like RoboCop to go in and defeat the bad guy, but it's F. Murray Abraham, and he's just so dignified and brilliant as a character and as an actor that it roused my sense of a battle scene or something, but it was just between wits of two characters.
Episode 4, The Outside.
Longing to fit in at work, awkward Stacy begins to use a popular lotion that causes an alarming reaction while an unnerving transformation takes place.
I really enjoyed this episode. I felt more sympathetic, definitely, for Stacy. I liked the characters overall, even though, well, mostly, I guess, her and her husband are the main characters. The catty in crowd, I guess. Well, I mean, they're not that catty. They didn't invite her, at least. But yeah, I thought it was really strong commentary and harsh look at the ghastly consequences of self-doubt, beauty standards, and ideas of femininity.
One of the questions I was going to ask you was about what the fucking message was of this, because it seems to go all over the place. But the consumerism and the beauty standards thing is,
Yeah.
I think.
I think the biggest point is like it's, well, that she feels very much not right and abnormal. That, of course, this product that's great for everyone else, of course, she's the one that would have this bad reaction to it. But I think it's just her self-worth has gotten so crushed that she doesn't feel valid anymore, and partially because of things like pressures of beauty standards. It's just like such a hard thing for her to get back that, especially when, you have so many targeted looks of this is what the perfect, or ideal woman should look like. And it's not just a, gender thing. I think men have a lot of those pressures too, especially if it's Hollywood or, you even hear some actors like having to go to these extreme lengths and starve themselves and be on this insane, regimen because the character is expected to be like this perfectly sculpted body. So I think a lot of it is just kind of those pressures. And it's almost like these women aren't necessarily putting it on her, but it's just that idea just gets so cemented in her mind that she is not worthy as she is and she is not valid, that she has this just like utter desperation to self-harm, essentially. Like she, no matter what it takes, even if she is essentially poisoning and just falling apart in order the hope of this aspiration of what she should be, and someone who feels abnormal, desperate to feel normal.
Yeah, and by the way, that thundering sound you're hearing is the rain coming down abnormally hard. I was actually curious about everything you just said. Makes sense in that I wasn't sure what her motivations were. It seemed to me, based on the infomercial, that she was feeling shunned or feeling like an outsider compared to her coworkers, and she was doing this so she could fit in with them. But I think their attitude toward her was that she didn't quite mesh, but they still invited her to the Christmas party and they weren't like villains.
Yeah.
They were just shallow, fake people that would represent perhaps a facet of womanhood society that would be considered very, very fake. And she was more like a genuine person, but felt very insecure. And I think what you're saying about her motivation being not necessarily about fitting in, but just her self-esteem, the pressures of society fits better with, why she's going through all this more than just trying to fit in with her friends. The women that she works with at a bank, they have a very bad attitude against their husbands, and they're perceived as being very gold digging and also very rich. And when we go to the party itself, the biggest plot hole is how they live in this, like the main antagonist, Gina, the blonde with big boobs and so forth. She lives in a mansion. She's obviously very rich. There's a Ferrari parked out front, all these expensive cars, which presumably belong to her coworkers who are attending this Christmas party. Yet why would they all work at a bank as tellers? Why would they need to work at all? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, they probably don't need to work. I assume that their wealthiness does not come from the bank, but, married well. And like, I think a few of them are talking about, I'm getting this in the divorce, or I'm going to do this before, I'm going to get this plastic surgery before I get divorced. So definitely very gold digger benefiting off a man. So yeah, in a lot of ways, they kind of don't represent the, I don't know, I guess most feminist portrayal or strong, individual woman. And yeah, in a lot of ways, she's the total opposite because she has a pretty great marriage. Like her husband was wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, he's like so supportive and understanding, and tell her she's valid and beautiful, and other things, and more just about who she is as a person and all that. But I think it's just that self-doubt of like, it doesn't matter no matter how much someone else tells you that. Like, if you don't believe it, then it's just, she just cracks under it. Maybe it could have been slightly more powerful if they had a moment of like what made her crack to be like, oh, I want this other life, when seemingly she had a lot of good things in her life and she seemed to enjoy her hobbies and being, who she was. I'm sure growing up, probably taxidermy wasn't like the thing that the cool kids did, So like, if that's something that brought her joy and passion before, and she's like, I'm going to do this. This is something that I, like. And then all of a sudden, oh, I'm too weird. I'm too different. I'm not beautiful enough.
Once she starts taking this cream, which is called Aloe Glow, strange things start happening. She starts seeing things and conversing with the television and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, what is the motivation of this lotion itself? It's like the villain. It's a personification of all the negative traits that the women that she works with has, and applying it is turning her more in that direction. But is she just crazy? Is she imagining all this stuff? It has a physical effect, a rash and some other aspects to her. And I'm wondering, like, why is this happening? Who's behind it? Is there an intelligence, or is it just there as a metaphor without really putting in the work to explain how it could be?
Her husband comments on what this is doing to her. So I think the physical aspects are really happening. I do assume that most of her interactions with the TV and such are delusions, and almost her desperation and feeling like, oh, this has to fix me. Like, she needs it to fix her, in her mindset. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is not necessarily the product itself, because it doesn't really have the same effect on other people, but I think it just adds more to her feeling more abnormal, that, oh, this is a miracle cure for other people, and having this bad effect on me because she feels so abnormal.
I got confused where we have the main blonde Gina antagonist having applied the cream in the very first scene that we see her. So I'm thinking, is Gina the way she is because she's been taking the cream, and when you use the cream, you just turn into a Gina, basically. Mm-hmm. And then at the Christmas party, she gives the cream out to everybody. And I'm thinking, is that like an Invasion of the Body Snatchers kind of thing, where she's sort of spreading out this contagious thing in an attempt to have all of her friends turn into more of a Stepford Wives kind of a situation. Mm-hmm. And all the women start taking the lotion, and nobody seems to have any reaction like Stacy does. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the story, none of them have changed in any slightest way, have any kind of rash, or they're the same people as in the start. So I was confused as to if it was actually the cream that did anything, or if it was meant to sound like it was just an internal struggle that Stacy was having behind the whole thing. But Stacy does physically change as a result of taking this stuff. So what the fuck?
Yeah, I think almost the cream isn't like really the culprit. That could have been an interesting turn to have some, other cult or malicious, or, supernatural focus that it went into.
I felt confused about the era it was taking place in. It seemed mid-90s with the infomercials, or maybe late 90s.
Yeah.
But then she's watching it on a HD flat screen TV that was more mid-2000s. Mm-hmm. And while watching that TV, she would pull out a telephone with a very long pull-out antenna for her wireless phone. It was like mid-80s. So I'm trying to figure out what year this thing was taking place, but they kept giving us clues that were all over the place. I don't know if that was intentional, but I found it annoying.
Yeah, I guess I didn't like hone in on those details, but yeah, I guess that's valid because that kind of, yeah, it does seem little mixed time periods there.
With all that said, I think this episode contained the greatest volume of such errors and inconsistencies and little minor confusions by far, but it was delightful to watch. And the lead actress, I don't know her name.
Her name is Kate Masucci.
Thank you.
She was on Scrubs and also played Velma in the Scooby-Doo animated series and on the Supernatural crossover episode with Scooby-Doo.
Wow, I did not know that, but she was absolutely delightful. I just couldn't take my eyes off her. She was just so charming and adorable and quirky.
Yeah, she's great.
And her husband, too. I thought it was Sam Rockwell
Martin
at first.
Starr.
What was he in? Because he looked really
He
familiar.
was first kind of had his claim to fame from Freaks and Geeks, but he does a lot of comedy stuff. He's been in a lot of like Judd Apatow movies.
That must be it.
Yeah. Knocked Up, I think.
Oh.
I think he was in that.
Oh, that guy. Oh, my God. Yeah. I know who you're talking about. He was in a few of those Seth Rogen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he's great. Episode 5, Pikmin's Model.
Art student Will meets introvert Richard. Ugh. Art student Will meets introvert Richard, whose terrifying works of art begin to have a deeply disturbing effect on Will's sense of reality. Let me start by saying that prior to being a filmmaker, I was a graphic artist and website designer. I used to draw photorealistic pencil portraits of people and animals. I dabbled in painting and other mediums. I even wrote an art instruction book. I used to work in an art supply store. I did picture framing for a few years, and my father's an artist, primarily a sculptor, life-size human figures. So I grew up around all that kind of stuff. So if anything, this episode was the one for me. However,
Oh boy.
I could not connect with any of these characters or their plights. I was just there watching it, feeling nothing, including anything related to horror. I don't know, the story was kind of like The Ring, but instead of watching a videotape, you're watching a painting, and then it curses you, and there's even a scene where the son glimpses the painting, and they're freaking out, and he has nightmares, and it's a curse to him, but it's not like in 7 days you're going to die.
To be fair, this story definitely came out long before The Ring.
Very true. And I don't want to say that as a knock against it, but as a descriptor of what it's basically about, that's it, except so many of them could be the main antagonist. We have the artist who produced them. Is he the source of the evil? The paintings he's producing seem to be possessed. So is there some curse there? He's related to some witch from a few generations past. Is she the thing? At the very end, they talk about some other evil working its way over to our universe somehow. I didn't know what the throughput, if that's the word, on what the actual threat was supposed to be. So I felt very disjointed about that. And I did like Crispin Glover a lot. I have always loved him. He's amazing. I couldn't understand more than 2 out of 3 words coming out of his mouth with his heavy, what kind of accent was that, would you say? It wasn't like a Cockney accent.
I'm not sure. It was a creepy Crispin Glover accent, I guess.
It was like an old, very, very...
Yeah, like old English maybe, but like
New York-y
something else. Yeah.
New England-y, but he was brilliant in it. And I think the best part of it, the main protagonist guy always looked like a really young man, despite how much makeup and gray hair and mustaches.
That's fair. He is fairly young.
Yeah. So I wasn't really sold on that, but that's not his fault. Nonetheless, I don't know why. This one was a slog for me to sit through, and I was very utterly detached the whole time, and I kind of hated it.
Oh, wow. Here's the fun part. I think this was my favorite one. Yeah, I just found it to be like incredibly haunting and a very powerful Lovecraft adaptation that I thought was executed beautifully with immense depth. They really tackled the concrete monsters as well as the crippling madness and the psychological torment certain knowledge brings. And you're asking what the point is. I think that's like the biggest villain, or the point that that it is a real monster that he's creating, and there is sort of a toxic kind of poison that the artwork itself brings about, but it's almost more like what really is the downfalling is just the knowledge that there's, you know, this wider multiverse and these horrific monsters that exist and are so unrelenting and powerful, and it's almost just that knowledge is just like too much, where it just brings him to madness and sort of just through this horrible descent that he can't grip with that knowledge. I really like the ideas of monsters and darkness living in art. You know, I always love anything where art kind of takes on a power and mind of its own, but I also like that it was something like concrete too, and how it just dug into your subconscious and getting one to believe one's own delusions and flaws were their downfall, only to realize it was this big, real, unrelenting, unstoppable force that he really couldn't go up against.
Some points that confuse me the most are as follows. We have him as a young man in school, and then he arrives late for a function to the disgruntlement of his love. And she basically dumps him right there. That's it. We're through. Literally, the next scene cuts forward 17 years, and they're married with a kid. Like, wait, what? They just broke up. There's no, like, why would that breakup scene even exist if they're going to be married in the next scene, unless they're going to explain some significance behind it? And then we see a few glimpses in dream sequences where he's not of any of the earlier or later period. He has gray hair, but he has no mustache. So when the hell are those flashbacks supposed to be taking place, and why are they even there at all? I suppose there could have been some continuity issue. Maybe they shot those at a different period and they forgot the mustache or something. I don't know. But I'm confused by that. And also, there's a scene where he witnesses her father in a carriage with a witch or whatever it is. And it's revealed like, oh, her father is somehow in on it, but that's never followed through. I don't understand why that's there if they never touch it again. And the father is a normal guy who only exists in the next scene very briefly. So is this supposed to be some curse that's he's just making up because he's seeing it everywhere? I don't understand what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's more of these monsters and bigger forces, and how like he sees that it's how it's touching other people. So I didn't view it that the father is necessarily malicious or like in on the monsters necessarily. But it's more just like once his mind is open to all this, it's like all he can see. Yeah, I'm not sure when. I think anything that's like a nightmare kind of makes like I think that has some leeway to make perfect sense in time periods and logistics, because it's just his torment and his mind taking over him, and things in dreams aren't always 100% as is in real life. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I didn't. I hear you didn't have the same like issues or flaws. It works for me.
I respect the fact that you liked it, and I can see where you're coming from. And I do like a lot of those same points. There's even an old Night Gallery episode that had a similar looking monster in a painting that this reminded me of, that I thought was rather creepy, but I couldn't quite put all the pieces together. And strange little things annoyed me, how he would be walking home at night through a graveyard. Like, who does that? It just seems...
But that's beautiful scenery. You gotta get in the creepy, ethereal, inquisitive nature.
It seemed convenient that he would be walking home alone at night through a graveyard to get home. It seemed like...
Maybe he lives on the other side. That's the only way.
I found it to be a stretch.
I will say, yeah, your comment about the breakup scene, that's probably the most I mean, it's all valid, but yeah, when right after that, it took me a minute to be like, oh, is that supposed to be the same like woman? And then I'm like, okay, yeah, it is. Seems like they could have had maybe like one more scene of like I don't know, they have a fight, but then they make up or something like that.
My theory is that there was a scene like that
Yeah.
shot, and they just cut it for time because it's already like an hour and something.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, hated it, but
All right.
it's not like a universal hatred. I can appreciate Crispin Glover and what they were going for. I'll just say it's the weakest one of the 8 for me,
Okay.
and maybe that's the nicest way I can put it.
Episode 6, Dreams in the Witch House.
Years after his twin sister's death, a researcher ventures into a dark, mysterious realm with the aid of a special drug determined to bring her back.
So this one was also based on a H.P. Lovecraft story. Yeah, 5 and 6 were probably my favorites. There was a lot of sort of dark, ethereal, intriguing things going on with this, and some very human flaws and loss, and just that inability to let go, as well as kind of opening up to one of the bigger themes of this series, and just being aware of the vastness of this multi-dimensional universe. And that pretty mostly brings us to the Forest of Lost Souls is where a lot of this is taking place, and just that entire atmosphere and concept I found to be just so enthralling and dismal and tragic and sort of wretched and beautiful and all the wonderful contrasting things. I also really liked the antagonist in this one. It just had a very wretched, primal, twisted look and power, and of course had to have I guess was their familiar was a man rat, because of course not enough rats that in twisted, contorted, disgusting ways.
The episode starts off, I thought it was almost a bad joke, but Rupert Grint stars in this one as a protagonist who played Ronald Weasley.
Mm-hmm.
And the very, very beginning where Guillermo's introducing it, he pulls out what looks just like a wand.
Oh, yes. I'm like, oh, yes, we're gonna give him the magic episode.
Yeah, I thought it shouldn't have looked exactly like a wand. Like that, it almost seemed like...
It was a witch, though. There's a witch episode.
That's true, wasn't it? I mean, I thought it was more described as a dagger in the story itself. But anyway, I thought that was kind of foul at first, but it was also befitting in a strange way.
You gotta throw the Potter nerd something.
Like you, yeah. I really liked this episode. I thought Rupert's name, I don't know if I ever heard of another person named Rupert. That's just
it's a little more common in
more of a British thing.
Yeah.
He did a great job.
He's done a fair amount since then too, and which we talked in our last episode, Servant by M. Night Shyamalan. He's on that. He's really great in that. So, but overall he's done more kind of like, I don't know, offbeat dark dramas or quirky comedy type stuff. But I think Servant is the first horror thing I remember seeing him in, and then now this. And yeah, I was really, of course, initially excited. Well, there's a Guillermo del Toro horror anthology series. That was exciting. And then hearing that Rupert Grint was going to be on it, I'm like, oh, wow, this is incredible. But yeah, I thought he did a really great job. He's, really good with that kind of dark drama and desperation and kind of human emotions. And yeah, I just really like seeing him in sort of dark, ethereal worlds is really cool. So yeah, it's a great role for him. And I'm glad he's getting some kind of more complex, darker material to work with.
Did the fact that the rat had a human face, did that make it worse for you or better?
It's interesting. I don't know. It was like probably, well, I find everything about rats very disgusting. So like even there was a moment in the Graveyard Rats episode where there was a version that's a little bit more abnormal or, a little different than typical rat traits. And that one was gross and disgusting, but I think it didn't affect me as much of the hordes of the rats themselves. So in a way, it's probably less disgusting because especially, it's augmented face on a rat. But yeah, definitely in a way it was more abnormal and disgusting, but I think it was more what that rat does towards the end that was just horrifying. That's definitely going to be added to my nightmares. So well done, Guillermo del Toro. Episode 7, The Viewing.
A wealthy recluse hosts for a wealthy recluse. A wealthy recluse hosts 4 accompanied. Every word I can't. Try this. Take a deep breath. A wealthy recluse hosts 4 accomplished guests. I said that right, and I still stopped. Wait for the airplane. Okay. A wealthy recluse hosts 4 accomplished guests at his stylish mansion for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but their intrigue soon turns into terror. I have interesting feelings about this one. It felt very Tarantino-esque, or had a grindhouse feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
I loved the aesthetic with its bold anamorphic lenses with flares. Drug use was very much in the forefront of the themes and the vibe of it. It felt kind of like you were on drugs watching it. I say that as someone who's never taken drugs.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say the vast majority of it takes place in one room with a bunch of people sitting around a table talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yet it was compelling.
Yeah.
The characters were very distinct. I remember being on jury duty earlier this year and being in a room full of 12 people and noticing how distinct each person was as a character in a way. And it strikes me how in real life you see people who aren't even trying, they're just very distinct individuals, and your writing should reflect that. And this is an example where everybody in that room was just so distinct as a character. My favorite was it Charlotte?
That sounds right. The scientist?
Yes. She was just so funny and quirky and delightful to watch the whole time. There was a very strong visual aesthetic to the whole thing, which takes place 79, I think, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it stars Peter Weller as the main, I don't know if you can call him an antagonist, but he was most notable for being RoboCop, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. I don't know if there's a message behind all the drug use, but they intensified what they were ingesting more and more with each round. And it even started off with him taking what appeared to be heroin. And I'm wondering how much the human heart, the body in general, can take, considering how much stuff he put in his body. But perhaps as a commentary on just the era, I'm not even sure what the point was for them to all do that. He does describe it as being all of them being in sync. It seemed irrelevant to what they were about to encounter towards the end. It felt very much like this was the origin story for what could be a monster movie. Was just so out of this world towards the end. And I really liked this episode. And I'm surprised that it held my attention despite the fact that it was just a bunch of people talking around a table and nobody was really getting to the point of why they were even there until the last 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, and I think that was, in the beginning, it starts with them trying to figure out a commonality between them. They just kind of get this mysterious invitation. They don't really know what's going on or what this is about. But there's obviously some intrigue and good mystery there. But yeah, so I think it was that dread and that wonder of what's this leading to, and you definitely put in the thought that there might be some sinister intent here. So yeah, just kind of seeing it unravel and just the tension of it worked really well. Yeah, and I guess who knows? Yeah, the drug use might have been a commentary, might have been something just to be. Maybe it made them more susceptible to seeing the otherworldly monsters and wider things of the universe and things like that. But yeah, I don't know if it had a super powerful point, but it was interesting and well done. And I think this was the only one that was actually created for the show that wasn't based on an existing story. Also, you were commenting on the style. Did you see Mandy with Nicolas Cage?
No.
This but same director, and like I was when I was looking into like the directors that did each piece, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. This was the director of Mandy because it's kind of a lot. It might just be sort of the style that the director likes because it's definitely a lot of that colorful, gritty sort of. I don't know, not quite. I guess Mandy isn't really cosmic horror; it's more revenge horror, but it kind of has that same look and style of this. So
Is it good, Mandy?
yeah, it's pretty good. It's a good like revenge story, essentially, is what it is. But yeah, it's well done and brutal and gritty. Definitely, it takes a little time to show to get there. It's kind of like a slow burn for the first hour-ish, but then things start to get weird and brutal, and yeah, it goes
Hmm.
from there.
I really like this one weirdly, and I can't tell you why. It just very stylistically
hmm
was very interesting, and I found the ending probably the most satisfying of all the endings of all the episodes.
It ends with a bang. But yeah, I agree. I think it's the unique characters, the writing, visuals, kind of everything comes together. But for me, I think it was that mystery and dread of like what's about to go down, and then of course we get our answer. Episode 8, The Murmuring.
Mourning, mourning a major loss. That sounded too forced, didn't it? Mourning a major loss. Oh fuck. Or ornithologists. Does that sound right?
Probably. Let's see. Ornithologist? That sounds right.
Okay, they probably could have picked a different, like bird doctors
Bird
or something.
watchers.
Okay, so mourning a major loss, ornithologists Nancy and Edgar Flock. That's not their last name. Mourning a major loss, ornithologists Nancy and Edgar flock to a secluded home.
So much bird action in that description.
Mourning a major loss, ornithologists Nancy and Edgar flock to a secluded home to study birds, but the house's history reveals heartbreak and horror. Do you have anything to say about this episode? Because I have practically nothing.
Yeah, this one, like, I appreciated it and I liked it, but it didn't grip me. This one definitely felt like it was moving slower. Like most of the other episodes, I was pretty enraptured and in it with them every moment. This one, I was definitely sympathetic. I guess I was less on the like edge of what this mystery was between what had happened in the house before, and they kind of hint that the couple is going through loss. So you kind of get more of a look at what that is throughout. But yeah, I wasn't really like, oh my God, what's going to happen? What's going on here? So I think it's just like more of a slightly slower, solemn look at the grieving process, and it definitely digs into human loss and suffering and that desperation again we see here. But it's more the loss of trying to cope when you lose something. For many parents that would be the most unfathomable thing, and there was something kind of beautiful in her having this empathy and care and diving into this mystery of what happens in this what essentially seems like a haunted house that they're in, and something strange and unusual, and pulling the birds to their house, and wondering, seeing the pictures on the wall and who were these people who lived here before us. And the female protagonist is seeing visions and ghosts, and so she is kind of being triggered and haunted, but comes at it with a sympathetic eye and gets very consumed in what happened to them, as her very supportive, understanding husband is trying to be there for her and trying to hold on to the love that they had while they're both grieving and suffering. And I like where they went in the end, that it showed kind of what almost it took finding someone else's pain and trying to understand and almost release that before she could release and focus on her own pain.
I'm glad you said that because I was trying to connect how her personal journey with her son intermingled with this ghost story, and I wasn't entirely sure how to articulate why solving this ghost story would allow her to release her own pain. They weren't really connected aside from the fact that a child was involved.
Mm-hmm.
Their stories weren't really similar, so I didn't quite get that.
Yeah, I think maybe because maybe it was too difficult for her to put herself in the mindset of her own kid that was lost, that it made it easier for her to try to understand and empathize and sort of help this other lost child spirit who was seemingly wasn't accepting either what had happened or wasn't ready to move on because it's obviously still lurking in the house, and he felt very much lost and traumatic. And I guess her helping him enabled her to kind of release her own demons and horrors of her past.
I felt, as you did, that this was a very slow burn,
Mhm.
and I felt like this one could have been slashed and burned to maybe 35 minutes, and it would have been about the same information conveyed. And
Mhm.
there were even scenes that were repeated where
Yeah.
he would try to show affection and she would flip out about it. And I thought, well, didn't we already see that in the last,
He was really trying. He's like, "Come on, give me something." But I liked him a lot too. Like, I love seeing, everyone is entitled to feel and grieve how they do. But I like that the series had several strong male characters who were supportive and understanding. I feel like it can kind of be a bad trope in horror sometimes where the husband just condemns them. You're crazy. It's in your mind. I'm not, um, giving this any validity. And I mean, it's just as important to have, I think, strong, understanding, compassionate male characters, which this series gave us a lot of. So I liked that.
I noticed that too. And the husband, whose name I can't remember, is the Walking Dead guy.
Oh, okay. I only watched like the first season of Walking Dead.
Oh, he's like the main sheriff leader character of The Walking Dead, but he was very good. And I felt there were a few small points that I that are technical issues with,
Hmm.
that aren't really issues, but points that I was curious about. They have an aspect ratio where there's a very thin border of black on the sides. And I'm like, why didn't they just fill up the whole screen? Is there some sort of a advantage to using this obscure aspect ratio? And this was the episode where I noticed more. I have a thing about when I'm color correcting something, I tend to prefer it to look natural, like it's how you would see it in a 1970s movie. The colors aren't really stylized or made too much of a departure from what you would see in real life. And this one, they got a little bit too artsy with it, and the employment of deep blues in the dark areas and so forth. There was an aesthetic to it, but
Hmm.
it was so much that I shouldn't have noticed it.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the motivation was going to be. I was still waiting to see what this was kind of about. And
Hmm.
haunted houses are my favorite subgenre of horror, and there was some fascination with this backstory of it all, but it just it was just kind of slow and boring and didn't really do anything for me. And I thought they should have ended the series on a stronger episode. There should have been
Hmm.
something else that they put there instead that really left a good feeling about the whole overall experience. And I think that was probably one of the worst ones they could have put there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end I appreciated what they did and what that journey of grief was. And yeah, it intrigued me throughout, but yeah, it was a bit of a slower and repetitive pull through a lot of it where I was empathetic and cared and felt for the characters, but I wasn't overly connected. So yeah, I think it's not a bad entry, but yeah, I could see ending the series with a bigger bang and more of what like the core of the series was really trying to do. Yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it and thought it was a strong, dark, explorative horror series that connected and hit a lot of themes really well. I think the biggest point of the series is the simple reality, for better or worse, that we are not alone in this universe of space and time. There are monstrous creatures that would prey on us and consume us. Sometimes that knowledge is all-consuming, and the true death sentence far worse than human grief or struggle.
If you would like to join our Society of Grotesquerie and Loathing, please subscribe and give whatever form of like or approval the platform you are on provides.
Comment your wretched thoughts below, along with what you would like us to expose in future episodes.
Keep our podcast suffering on by... Keep our podcast suffering on by finding it on... This is the line you said last time.
Take it slow. Enunciate.
Keep our podcast suffering on by finding it in your cold, black, withered hearts to support us on... Keep our podcast suffering on by finding it in your cold, black, withered hearts to support us on Patreon.
A link to our PayPal is also below for one-time donations of any amount.
It was nice knowing you.